In the next 10 years, a third of the people in sub-Saharan Africa will be suffering from chronic hunger.
There's an unrealism about the seriousness of the world food problem that I find rather scary.
Everything should be done to uproot poverty and break the cycle of poverty in Africa.
If nothing is done, food shortages are an impending catastrophe in Africa south of the Sahara. Yet its agriculture has immense untapped potential.
The potential is there, but the potential, you can't eat potential. You've got to have reality, grain and food to eat, to relieve human misery.
The Greble family live near Boimi in Benin, West Africa, with 3 adults and 7 children to feed on half a hectare of land. They live on the edge of survival, like tens of millions of other families in Africa south of the Sahara.
In a bad year, this family will, without any doubt, starve. Left alone, they cannot make it. This is not an exceptional family. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than 60% live below the level of poverty.
I don't know if the word catastrophe really describes it properly. The future of African children is really bleak. Now, I imagine a pregnant woman, chronically hungry, therefore the baby growing up chronically hungry, being born and never being able to have a full meal.
The African population for the last 3 decades has been growing at more than 3% on the average. Food production has been growing at 2%. So we are losing ground per capita every year. And for that reason, I think it's very urgent that Africa gives #1 priority to developing its agriculture, to approach self-sufficiency in the basic cereal.
"200 years ago, world population was less than 1 billion. 70 years ago, it had risen to 2 billion. Today, nearly 6 billion, and every 3 seconds a child dies through lack of food. In the next 50 years, it will double to about 11 billion. The population bomb has gone off."
This is starvation yield, and that's what we've got too much of in the world.
Dr. Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for bringing a higher-yielding agriculture to subsistence farmers in India and Pakistan after the famines of the 60s. It came to be known as the Green Revolution.
But there's some other variable here also.
Now, through the Sasakawa Global 2000 program, he's inspiring a new green revolution in Africa south of the Sahara, the region of the world most under threat of food shortages, with 10 million more people living in absolute poverty every year. Ghana, Benin, and Tanzania. 3 very different countries, but each of their populations will double in the next 22 years, and they face a common urgent task: to revolutionize their agriculture.
The traditional agriculture is based on slash and burn. That means the farmer has to cut down the vegetation, burn the vegetation, and then plant his seed. Traditional shifting cultivation was a stable system from an ecological point of view when the population pressure was low. Today, of course, farmers are forced to stay on the same piece of land, and so we have what we call continuous cultivation.
The Greble family have no choice but to try and survive on the same half-hectare plot. The work is backbreaking, and the returns are very poor.
People historically have settled on fertile soils where there's enough rainfall to do good crop production. What is outstanding now, what it's amazing now, it's to see these very fertile soils producing so little. The reason why, it's massive nutrient depletion. The nutrients have been taken out mainly as crop harvests and not returned enough via crop residue returns or manures or fertilizers, and therefore the soil has been gradually depleted of nutrients. So what was once very fertile, excellent soils is now just totally infertile soil.
Now, with increase in population pressure, farmers are moving to the marginal lands, the lands on the hill slopes, lands that they have traditionally not touched and tampered with. As they cut down the trees on these hill slopes, erosion now becomes a menace. The land becomes heavily eroded and degraded, and it is absolutely impossible to grow any trees on such lands.
Cattle are another major factor in soil erosion in some areas. As more land is taken over by agriculture, there is less for groups such as these Barbeg pastoralists in Tanzania. The available land is overgrazed and eroded by the cattle's hooves, leaving the soil stripped of its vegetation. The combined effects of cattle and farming in this area of Tanzania have been disastrous. This extraordinary gully has been formed in only 4 years by the effect of torrential water on the bare soil during the rainy seasons.
There's one simple rule on controlling soil erosion. Keep a vegetative cover on top of that soil at all times. When the fertility of the soil goes down, your crops are so weak that there's nothing much growing in the field, so you have bare spots and you have erosion. Then the farmers are so desperate that they grab all the crop residue stalks and non-grain things after harvest and do something with them. In the case of Ethiopia, burn them for fuel. So the soil is even more bare. You have bare soil, here comes the rain, big splashes, big drops, and the soil goes downhill. And the part of the soil that gets eroded is the topsoil, the best part.
Here in Babati, Tanzania, the lake is silting up. It is a growing ecological disaster over large areas of Africa, with increasingly tragic consequences.
As population goes up and at the same time nutrient depletion continues unabated, land degradation becomes a real nightmare. And it gets to the point that people are leaving the land, that people are fighting for each other's neighbors' land. And let me say that a lot of the catastrophes in Rwanda and Burundi have this nutrient depletion, fertility depletion as one of the underlying causes of it.
Agriculture has to hold the line to produce the food that is needed for a rapidly growing world population. But at the same time, that line cannot be held indefinitely. It's a question of holding the line while the world population is being educated to the fact that there's a certain carrying capacity of this planet Earth, utilizing its land and water resources.
The Babati district in the Arusha region of Tanzania. Farming here shows perplexing differences between neighboring farms. On one side of the hill, the Cody family harvest their crop of red sorghum. Like the Greble family, they use entirely traditional low-yielding methods. Without an improved agriculture, their family is condemned to a life without food security, dependent on unreliable rain-fed cultivation and worsening soil fertility.
You feel at a loss to understand why the resources cannot be more fully exploited in order to improve their lives. It's a sad situation because, in a sense, they are locked into some kind of spiral of increasing poverty. Without making some investments in the farm, it's difficult to imagine how they can break out of this vicious cycle of poverty, because you begin to reverse that process when you get additional income.
On the other side of the hill live Barnabas and Lavina Bura. 20 years ago, when they first came here, they lived with the same food insecurity as the Cody family. The critical change for them came 4 years ago when they started to adopt more intensive cultivation.
Wherever there's a technology which benefits the farmer, of course he's interested in adopting it. And many of the farmers have shown a great deal of keenness to increase their productivity and therefore their income.
The basic package of Green Revolution technologies includes improved seed varieties and soil fertility, coupled with better crop management. These factors alone can increase yields of maize by 3- or 4-fold. The Cody family also grow maize, and for them this year has given a good crop because there was enough rain. But unlike their neighbors, they have not invested in fertilizer or improved seed, and in comparison with the Buras, their yield is very low. Perhaps the most important reason is that, like most farmers in Africa, the Cody family have had no contact with the so-called extension service, people whose job it is to bring new technologies to farmers. They've had neither the knowledge nor the money to improve their agriculture. The Buras have been lucky enough to have had both. They have been given the knowledge by the Extension Service, and in the first year of trying the new methods, they were loaned improved seeds and chemical fertilizer, loans which were paid back in full after harvest. The tripling of their yields has generated a period of unprecedented prosperity for them. They can now store maize for the future, so they don't have to sell their grain immediately after harvest, when prices are low. They have invested in oxen to plough their fields, as well as renting them to neighbouring farms, another source of income. They can also afford for their children to go to school, giving them much wider options for future employment. More income means more and better food, with all the resulting health benefits. A model for neighbouring farmers to learn from. So the success of Extension in introducing new technologies to the Buras will have a much wider impact on the whole community.
I get an inspiration when I come to this farm because I see someone who is applying all the knowledge that he has at his disposal. In the long term, we see farmers such as Barnabas Bura as the future of African agriculture because they represent a transition from small-scale to emergent commercial-scale farmers who are going to underpin the level of production at a level which will meet the food demands of the future.
A great success story. But none of this would have happened without improvement of soil fertility. The Bura's large herd of cattle are a great asset in providing manure, but literally tons of manure are needed to restore soil fertility, Even the Boers have nothing like enough. So they supplement it with chemical fertilizer.
A plant needs 17 essential nutrients, of which 2 are the most important and critical: nitrogen and phosphorus. They need nitrogen to form protein and phosphorus for general livelihood. They are essential nutrients. Without them, no organisms, plant or animals or humans, could live.
For higher crop yields, nitrogen is the nutrient most needed. So are there any alternatives to chemical fertilizer?
Bonjour. Bonjour. Ça va bien? Ça va bien. En forme? Oui.
Dr. Marcel Galiba is an agricultural scientist who advocates green manures, trees or plants like this macuna or velvet bean, which can absorb nitrogen from the air.
It's a forgotten story. There were more than 2 million hectares of velvet bean in the United States. It only with the advent of cheap mineral fertilizer in the 40s that mucuna disappeared from the United States. Personally, I hope one day in Africa we can talk about a green manure revolution.
But even an enthusiast like Dr. Galiba only sees green manures as a supplement to fertilizers. At present, green manures can only restore a small fraction of Africa's huge nitrogen deficit. In the long term, they may be significant, but while population rises are steepest, additional chemical fertilizer will be essential. But isn't this a problem?
When people ask whether all you're interested in is using chemical, let me tell you what the plant root says. The plant root says, I don't give a hoot whether this nitrate ion, which I'm going to eat, comes from a fertilizer bag or from the decomposition of organic matter. It doesn't make any difference to the plant. So to me, the use of chemical fertilizers is a means to an end. And I advocate its strategic use very much in tune with organic sources of nutrients as well, the combination of both. The plant doesn't care.
This half of a farmer's test plot had no chemical fertilizer. The other half a modest application, resulting in dramatically increased yield. So do these chemicals damage the environment?
We have to admit that there's some truth to that. And the truth is in the pollution of rivers and drinking water and so on caused by excessive fertilizer applications in the temperate world.
In the temperate world, such as Europe, more than 200 kilograms of fertilizer nutrients per hectare is average. In Africa, the average is only about 10 kilograms.
This situation of excessive nutrient loading in the temperate world contrasts totally with nutrient depletion, which we have in Africa. It's just the opposite. And I would say, on the contrary, that improved, more productive agriculture in Africa will work very much towards environmental conservation. If you can produce much more in a hectare of fertile, productive soil, there is less need to go and clear additional land, which is very marginal. And that is certainly the case, and that has helped tremendously in Asia.
Just how crucial it is to intensify agriculture, both to protect the environment and, even more important, to feed people, is shown by the harsh lessons of China's recent history. In the late 50s, there were desperate food shortages in China. News films of the time celebrated bumper harvests. The reality was very different. Millions died. Maybe as many as 30 million. It was the biggest famine in human history. Behind the propaganda, the government knew that their population was exploding, that agriculture had been criminally neglected, and that maintaining soil fertility had become a life or death issue for millions. The Chinese led the world in using every possible source of organic matter, but it was nothing like enough. Since the famine, they made a series of crucial decisions to build fertilizer plants.
They made the largest investment in chemical fertilizer of any country in the history of the world. 1,000 ton a day anhydrous ammonia plants, the urea converters. They also initiated many small phosphate fertilizer plants made from domestic rock.
Chemical fertilizer is being used here in much larger quantities.
With the help of fertilizer, they transformed their agriculture. The newsreels no longer needed to lie about their harvests. Their green revolution has tripled cereal production since the early 60s.
Had they tried to produce that amount of cereal grain with the technology of 1960, without the chemical fertilizer, they would had to have cultivated an additional 200 million hectares of land of the same quality. They didn't have it.
China's investment in fertilizer plants was enormous. Without fertilizer, China's dreadful famines would have returned. Unlike China, Africa cannot afford to make the large investments needed for nitrogenous fertilizer production, so it must be imported. But what about the other major nutrient, phosphorus? Must this also be imported? Dr. Macournier discusses with Dr. Galiba an idea which the International Fertilizer Development Center is pioneering in Togo.
Togo mines and exports about 3 million tons of phosphate rock, which is used by the developed countries to manufacture phosphate fertilizers. But Togo's soils are devoid of phosphate. It's only now that we're beginning to say, what are we doing? We can use these materials that are indigenous to us.
There are vast deposits of phosphate in Togo. This open-cast mine is 7 kilometers long. In all, the deposits stretch for 45 kilometers. 24 hours a day, phosphates are dug from this mine and transported for processing at the beneficiation plant. Nearly all of Togo's foreign exchange comes from this single industry. Without it, the country would sink far deeper into poverty. But what Dr. Macournier is suggesting would not in any way threaten Togo's phosphate exports. As a byproduct of the production process, there is a slurry containing very fine particles of phosphate, too fine to have commercial value for export. When dried, this material is like dust.
We have called these materials the phosphate fines. We have taken some of this material and we've applied them to the fields. And lo and behold, they are very, very good in improving the phosphate fertility of the soils. In effect, this is really a win-win situation. The material that ought to be thrown away can be brought and applied to the farmlands.
There are widespread deposits of phosphate rock throughout sub-Saharan Africa. But to develop them for commercial crop production would take a decade or more. So imported phosphate fertilizer will still be essential in the medium term. What actually happens to the phosphate fines now is that they are simply discharged into the sea. It is tragic to see part of the lifeblood of Africa's soils simply pouring away. The sea here is green because of an algal bloom which is fed by the wasted phosphates.
There is a Chinese saying, we have not inherited this land from our grandparents. Rather, we have borrowed the land from our children.
Realizing the potential of these phosphate fines will need substantial research and development. Former Director of Agriculture for the World Bank, economist Dr. Edward Shue.
The investments we make in science and And those two fields, science and technology, are really the driving force of our economy today. I mean, if you look at increases in output across the economy in developed countries like US and Europe, et cetera, almost all of those increases in output are attributed to our investment, to past investments in science and technology. That is true in agriculture in spades.
One of the biggest factors which has held back African agriculture is lack of knowledge. Well-directed research and effective extension are crucial to technology transfer. Research is essential to develop new technologies and adapt existing ones to the local environment. But the critical question is, how will research benefit the farmer? Taking technologies out of the laboratory to farmers' fields needs both commitment from scientists and a better trained extension service.
The research stations are the pumps, the wells that are pumping out new knowledge. Unfortunately, in most developing nations, the linkage between research and extension is very weak.
Increasingly, though, there are scientists in Africa with a real commitment to overcoming this weak link and getting basic scientific knowledge to farmers. Dr. Catherine Kuite is a leading plant pathologist working on cereal crop diseases. And Dr. Mary Magonja is head of Tanzania's barley breeding program. But it is more than their specialist scientific knowledge which is making an impact on farmers. They are founder members of the Tanzanian Association of Professional Women in Agriculture and the Environment, and one of their main commitments is to make the results of scientific research available to help poorer communities. John and Edna Manzava picked the last few cobs in their field of maize in Bangalala village in Tanzania. From just over a hectare of maize, this year they picked enough for just 3 meals. A disastrous harvest for a family of 10 people.
It's like we have a price to pay, a debt to pay to these people, to the rural people. When you come and see other people starving or near starvation, then my conscience, touches me because I have a duty. I went to school not to save myself only, but to also help other people.
Without a thriving agriculture, these villages provide little future for the next generation. The problem with growing maize here is lack of water. They live in the rain shadow of Mount Kilimanjaro, so not enough rain to grow maize properly. But what do agricultural scientists like Dr. Kuite and Dr. Magonja have to offer a community like this?
But the main trouble is drought.
It's drought, yeah.
All dried up.
And some diseases too.
This is typical of maize grown in this area. This community only started to plant maize because of free handouts of maize as food aid. So now they're growing the wrong crop. But there is a crop which will grow well here.
This is a good variety because it's short and...
Sorghum is a cereal crop which feeds tens of millions of people in Africa. Knowing that it is much more drought-resistant than maize could fundamentally improve food security here. But this community has now got used to eating maize. So the scientists have joined hands with extension workers to persuade them to switch to sorghum. They identified the women as their primary focus.
Most times, if there is a meeting, the men will go and the women will be left behind farming. And then if they are introducing a new agricultural technology, the men gets it, but they don't practice it, and they will not come to teach the wives. So what you end up is that the technology has never been adopted. There have been a lot of projects which have failed because they are just touching one person. Our idea really is not only to touch the women only, we have to go to the men, because we have to value the family as such, as it is, as a unit, and recognize each individual as important, as having an important role to play in agriculture or in community development.
In African culture, it's the women who are responsible for food preparation. So we thought that the best way is, first of all, to introduce that technology to the women farmers and invite the men to come and eat the food. Then we could come back and introduce the technology on the growing of the sorghum crop.
Sorghum. We make it like it looks like rice.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
Morning. Yeah, you are most welcome to our sorghum processing and utilization demonstration.
Yes.
In view of the frequent drought.
Frederick Soumaya, then Tanzania's Minister of Agriculture, now Prime Minister, brought Dr. Borlaug to look at the preparation of sorghum dishes and to discuss the large-scale effects of poverty in the rural areas.
One of the sorghum dishes, this we call pilau.
To improve the quality in the rural areas, we must improve the farmers and the farming conditions so that you have more production. But otherwise, if we don't tackle this problem, we are lost.
To make some type of donuts, you can taste it certainly for sure. So
what we have had the privilege of seeing, and in a small, modest way participating with in your extension service on the basic food crops the last 8 years, indicates that you can double, triple, and quadruple the yield. And we have seen similar things in 6 other sub-Saharan countries. So the potential is there, but the potential, you can't eat potential. You've got to have reality, grain and food to eat, to relieve human misery. Otherwise, we will have worse and worse chaos.
Young men driven by poverty to the cities without proper jobs, a problem all over Africa south of the Sahara.
Most of the cities are now flooded with young men, almost doing nothing. They carry around some few things in their hands, trading in the streets, but which really does not make any living at all. When you have poverty, and when you cannot feed your own people, people have no money, people have no food, people have nowhere to stay, then the outcome is normally a civil strife.
In agriculture, the importance of economics cannot be underestimated. Agriculture needs a healthy economic climate to increase food production. But many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have moved into increasing economic crisis in the last few decades, resulting in huge external debts. Ghana's external debt is more than $4 billion, 2/3 of gross domestic product. Tanzania's is nearly $7 billion, 3 times gross domestic product. Over the last decade, the World Bank and the IMF have responded to this crisis by insisting that new loans are tied to drastic economic restructuring. This has had fundamental effects on 2 of the most critical inputs for improving agriculture, fertilizer and seed. TanSeed, Tanzania's state-run seed production business. Before the economic restructuring of Tanzania, this was the sole provider of certified seed for Tanzania's farmers. One of the key measures of the World Bank's restructuring was to open up the market to private producers, and this has left TanSeed in a state of crisis. Cargill seeds. They've been in Tanzania just over 5 years now and are expanding rapidly. There is a marked contrast between Cargill and TanSeed. TanSeed doesn't operate its machinery because they have no electric power most of the time. Cargill has its own generators. Cargill comes from a very different business climate. They are part of a vast multinational corporation, the largest grain merchants in the world. Their manager in Tanzania is Roger Banfield.
My marketing strategy is principally to have seed available to every farmer within half a day's walk, a day after there's a planting rain. That's my ideal. To expand the seed business in Tanzania, we need to improve the perception that improved seed in a bag, rather than seed from the back of your house, is the seed that is going to raise your yields and improve your lifestyle generally. It's going to give you a cash return if you sell the surplus.
Cargill are not the only international seed company to enter Tanzania. The commercial competition is heating up. But Tanseed, overstaffed and undercapitalized, appear to have little concept of how to compete. Economic realities are now forcing a culture shock from which they may never recover. But how good is business for Cargill? The market in Tanzania is primarily small-scale farmers, and in the present tough economic climate, they often don't buy improved seed. Cargill say they are in Tanzania for the long haul, but just how long will that be if they don't make good profits? Their plant arrived packed in containers and ready to assemble in their rented warehouse. It could just as easily leave the same way. So is there an alternative? Maybe the answer is here in Ghana.
I'm excited at this year's harvest. And with all my workers around me, my mother is right here. This is my daughter, and I have a very faithful supervisor there, Anthony.
Gloria Dua is one of Ghana's new seed growers. Since privatization, Ghana has actively promoted these smaller scale producers, perhaps a more viable alternative for Africa.
90% of my very faithful workers are women. We have women who come to apply.
Women, come for yourselves, the women.
The women do the fertilizer application. The women do the harvesting, they do the picking, they are going to do the shelling, and they are going to do the seed treatment.
Ghana has realized the strategic importance of a healthy seed business. Their seed inspection unit not only maintains standards, but also actively promotes good seed production.
We are doing cob selection.
Cob selection, discarding unsuitable cobs so that bad grain doesn't get into the final seed maize, is just one of the stringent standards which Ghana's seed inspection unit enforces.
For instance, if the tip is not good, we remove it.
Okay. Farming is a business, and therefore if you want to stay in farming, good quality seed is good business, and therefore you must understand it that way, that you can't provide a shoddy material and get away with it.
Most farmers don't yet use certified seed. They simply keep back some of their harvest for next year's planting. By supporting seed growers like Gloria Dua, Lance Delamini's seed inspection unit is trying to ensure that farmers don't miss out on the greatly increased yields which the newer varieties can give. Seed has great importance in developing more intensive agriculture. It has been at the heart of the green revolution throughout the world. Current research is making the new varieties more resistant to drought, pests, and diseases. A dynamic seed business needs pioneers like Gloria Dua. But even for a grower with her commitment and energy, in bad years, the economic package doesn't always add up.
Last year we had bad rainfall. 2 years ago, erratic rainfall. This year we have too much rainfall. And the inputs are so high, astronomically high. Now the prices of the produce is very low, comparatively very low, because at harvest you have plenty of it. There's no storage in, good storage facility. Generally, as a country, we don't have. So the prices at harvest is very low, and mainly, most of the time, the farmer is not able to break even.
So why are input prices, particularly of fertilizer, so high? The World Bank and IMF's economic restructuring has had a major effect on fertilizer prices due to the removal of subsidies and to currency devaluations. The fertilizer business too was privatized, but this has not, as yet, produced the intended benefits. For example, in Ghana, 4 companies competed for the market, but 3 of them rapidly went out of business. Wienco Limited is the sole remaining importer. But even with their monopoly position, it is hard to make a profit. The company accountant is the dynamic Dora Barnor.
Under normal circumstances, after the farming season, which is around July, August, our stock position should be negligible. That's only about a few bags. But we have $700,000 worth of goods. So we have quite a substantial stock standing, and this stock will have to wait for another 12 months before we'll be able to sell them.
The reason for Wienco's large unsold stock is the high price of fertilizer caused by soaring inflation and the removal of subsidy insisted on by the IMF. Ghana's Minister of Agriculture has to live with the consequences.
Structural adjustment seems to be unfriendly to agriculture. Once subsidies are withdrawn, that's coupled with local inflationary trends, shoots up input prices so much so that the average farmer is unable to afford them. The net result is reduced production resulting from reduced utilization of these inputs.
Hey, make it drop up, make it down, make it come down.
Subsidies were phased out by the early 90s. As prices have risen, fertilizer use has dropped catastrophically. Consumption now is barely a quarter of what it was in the late 80s. So should countries simply take the IMF's bitter economic medicine, or should some form of subsidy be restored on fertilizer? One of the past problems of subsidy was that it almost never reached the subsistence farmer.
Most of our fertilizer, for instance, was not being used in Ghana. It was being smuggled outside to neighboring countries where better prices were being offered. Subsidy removal has been controversial, but I believe that it is necessary because whereas the developed economies can afford to subsidize agricultural production, if sub-Saharan African countries want to do so or want to continue to do so, it would mean borrowing to finance the subsidies. And this does not make economic sense.
Making sense of sub-Saharan African countries was clearly a priority. Before restructuring, most of them were in an economic mess, and agriculture had suffered most. Manufacturing sectors were protected at the expense of agriculture, which was heavily taxed. Currencies were grossly overvalued, so inhibiting agricultural exports. Basic principles of good economic management had been abandoned.
These countries were enormously distorted. They were really enormously distorted. And you can't really expect a miracle when you go through a structural adjustment program. You can't expect it to get straightened out very quickly.
But the high cost of fertilizer remains. Some savings will certainly come through improved transport, bulk importation, better choices of fertilizer, and so on. But subsidies in Ghana were 45%, and in Tanzania, 75%. When you remove that level of subsidy, there are harsh consequences.
It's a very painful process. I'm glad I don't have to experience it. But my guess is, my judgment is that it's better to sort of go ahead and try to do that adjustment, get it behind you, and get on with the rest of your life.
I think there is a big problem of especially the developed world. They think They are the masters of every problems that we have. And therefore they always dictate the path to follow and how to solve that problem and so on. When they tell us don't give subsidies, I think really that does not help us. It's actually killing us.
Why has development been so slow in Africa over the last few decades? Elmina Castle, Cape Coast, Ghana, one of the primary centers for the European slave trade. A grim reminder of Africa's traumatic history of slavery and colonialism. A history whose long shadow still haunts the politics of Africa today.
Certain things take a long time to die. When the colonialists left, they didn't really leave. They kept lingering around in one form or another. In some cases, it was just independence on a piece of paper. Some of the leaders who were left behind by the colonial powers were actually puppets of those colonial powers. And for a long time, we really, as Africans, have suffered with that type of leadership.
People are talking about a great political failure in Africa. If we look at all those structural adjustment programs, they are a vivid sign of failure at the political level.
20% of the rich nations own more than 80% of the world's wealth. Unless there is a real change of the relationship, the poor countries will always continue to service the rich countries, and the poor countries will be becoming poorer and poorer.
The phase we are entering now is a phase of awareness. The new leadership in the different countries is coming up with the realization that they are really in charge of their countries. Either they manage or they sink.
It's not the international community to solve the problem. It's Africans themselves who must solve their own problem. But we can have some help from the international community, and we need the international community to work together. But the final issue, the final move belongs, I believe, to Africans themselves.
Grassroots action is fundamental to the positive changes which are happening in Africa today. The village of Bowime in Benin. The Ministry of Rural Development and Sasakawa Global 2000 have stimulated a dynamic process of change here, the sort of development which needs to happen all over Africa. The critical change has been for the farmers to pool their resources in a collective savings and loans association. If this were a normal bank, this farmer probably wouldn't even get through the door. Getting credit from local banks is virtually impossible for small-scale farmers, a serious problem for agricultural development in Africa. So this village took things into their own hands and set up what they call a CREP, which in French stands for Caisse Rurale d'Épargne et de Prêts, meaning Savings and Loans Association. Before borrowing money, members must first build up their savings in the CREP. One great benefit with the CREP is that it gives more interest than the banks on savings and charges less for loans. Dr. Marcel Galiba and his team visit as guests at the annual general meeting of the CREP. Dr. Galiba's team has been a catalyst in setting up this extraordinarily dynamic organization, which has had powerful leadership from their president.
One of the pillars of our activities is collective action. And small-scale farmers, taken alone, they can be weak, but as a group, they become a real driving force.
After only 4 years, Bowime's CREP has saved more than $100,000.
They know that their money is secure in the CREP because you should never forget the social system in this village. They all know each other. Nobody can run away because you have your family honor, pride, and dignity. And the beauty of it, you know, they've been giving loan for 2 years now, and the recovery rate is 100%.
One area where the CREP is paying new dividends is in food processing. Here the root vegetable, cassava, is being processed into gari, cassava flour. Traditional methods like this use an enormous amount of labor. Improved food processing technology, bought by a group of women in the village with a loan from the CREP, has significantly reduced their labor. It means greatly increased profit, which can then feed back into further development.
If you want to talk about sustainable development, it should come from farmers themselves. It should be a grassroots movement. To me, that's the future for Africa.
The women of Bowime take their gari to market at Azove, a 20-kilometer walk. The lives of these women will be fundamentally improved by their new economic power. Development at grassroots level can transform the economics of agriculture. New technologies are adopted for food production. Improved processing adds value to farmers' labor. Soon local industries start to develop and the economy takes off. In nearly every developed country in the world, it was an agricultural revolution which was the starting point, the engine of growth for the whole economy.
Agriculture can be an engine of economic development for a number of reasons. If you develop agriculture by producing the new technology to modernize it, what you in effect do is lower the price of food. That is equivalent to an increase in real income for everybody in the economy. The additional benefit is that low-income people spend a larger share of their income on food, so you're benefiting the poor relative to the upper income groups.
The world can no longer afford to neglect agriculture. Failure will create wide-scale human tragedy. Success will bring enormous rewards. Less than a kilometer from the village of Bowime, the Greble family fight to stay alive with their inadequate agriculture. Does the world have the political vision to ensure that millions like them in sub-Saharan Africa can realize the immense potential which exists here?
Sometimes you hear people who are in leadership arguing that the farmers don't know what they want. They know, it's just that we don't listen to them.
the competition between agriculture and other sectors for the limited resources of sub-Saharan African countries should be looked at one more time to place agriculture over and above everything else.
The governments of each country have to define their priorities. They have to state that improving soil fertility is very, very critical.
The soils can be brought back to the original level of fertility with adequate technologies and sensible policies. And if that's the case, we're going to see a very different Africa.
Agriculture should be the engine of growth, and the foundation of that agriculture should be small-scale farmers.
I think it's very urgent that Africa gives #1 priority to developing its agriculture to approach self-sufficiency in the basic cereals.